Chapter 11. Christianity. License and the making of the Christian world. The modern view of the orgy must at all costs be rejected. It assumes that those who took part had no sense of modesty at all, or very little. This superficial view implies that the men of ancient civilization had something of the animal in their nature. In some respects it is true these men do often seem nearer than ourselves to the animals, and it is maintained that some of them shared this feeling of kinship. But our judgments are linked to the idea that our peculiar modes of life best show up the difference between man and animal. Early men did not contrast themselves with animals in the same way, but even if they saw animals as brothers, the reactions on which their humanity was based was far from being less rigorous than ours. True, the beasts they hunted lived under material conditions much like their own, but then they erroneously ascribed human feelings to animals. In any case, primitive or archaic modesty is not always weaker than our own. It is only very different, more formalist, not so automatic and unconscious. No less lively for that, it proceeds from beliefs kept alive by a basic anguish. This is why when we discuss the orgy in a very general way, we have no grounds for seeing it as an abandoned practice, but on the contrary we should regard it as a moment of heightened tension. Disorderly, no doubt, but at the same time a moment of religious fever. In the upside-down world of feast days, the orgy occurs at the instant when the truth of that world reveals its overwhelming force. Bacchic violence is the measure of incipient eroticism, whose domain is originally that of religion. But the truth of the orgy has come down to us through the Christian world, in which standards have been overthrown once more. Primitive religious feeling drew from taboos the spirit of transgression. Christian religious feeling has by and large opposed the spirit of transgression. The tendency which enables a religious development to proceed within Christianity is connected with these relatively contradictory points of view. It is essential to decide what the effects of this contradiction have been. If Christianity had turned its back on the fundamental movement which gave rise to the spirit of transgression, it would have lost its religious character entirely, in my opinion. However, the Christian spirit retains the essential core, finding it in continuity in the first place. Continuity is reached through experience of the divine. The divine is the essence of continuity. Christianity relies on it entirely, even as far as to neglect the means by which the continuity can be achieved, means which tradition has regulated in detail, though without making their origin plain. The nostalgia or desire that opened up these paths managed to get partially lost among the details and calculations often dear to traditional piety. But in Christianity there has been a dual process. Basically, the wish was to open the door to a completely unquestioning love. According to Christian belief, lost continuity found again in God demanded from the faithful, boundless and uncalculated love, transcending the regulated violence of ritual frenzy. Man, transfigured by divine continuity, was exalted in God to the love of his fellow. Christianity has never relinquished the hope of finally reducing this world of selfish discontinuity to the realm of continuity afire with love. The initial movement of transgression was thus steered by Christianity towards the vision of violence transcended and transformed into its opposite. This ideal has a sublime and fascinating quality. Nevertheless, there is another side to the matter: how to adjust the sacred world of continuity to the world of discontinuity which persists. The divine world has to descend among the world of things. There is a paradox in this double intention. The determined desire to centre everything on continuity has its effect, but this first effect has to compromise with a simultaneous effect in the other direction. The Christian God is a highly organised and individual entity, springing from the most destructive of feelings, that of continuity. Continuity is reached when boundaries are crossed. But the most constant characteristic of the impulse I have called transgression is to make order out of what is essentially chaos. By introducing transcendence into an organised world, transgression becomes a principle of an organised disorder. Its organised character is the result of the organised way of its adherents. Such an organisation is founded upon work, but also and at the same time upon the discontinuity of beings. The organised world of work and the world of discontinuity are one and the same. Tools and the products of toil are discontinuous objects. The man who uses the tools and makes the goods is himself a discontinuous being, and his awareness of this is deepened by the use of creation of discontinuous objects. Death is revealed in relation to the discontinuous world of labour. For creatures whose individuality is heightened by work, death is the primal disaster. It underlines the inanity of the separate individual. Faced with a precarious discontinuity of the personality, the human spirit reacts in two ways which in Christianity coalesce. The first responds to the desire to find that lost continuity which we are stubbornly convinced is the essence of being. With the second, mankind tries to avoid the terms set to individual discontinuity, death, and invents a discontinuity unassailable by death, that is, the immortality of discontinuous beings. The first way gives continuity its full due, but the second enables Christianity to withdraw whatever its wholesale generosity offers. Just as transgression organised the continuity born of violence, Christianity fitted this continuity regarded as supreme into the framework of discontinuity. True, it did no more than push to its logical conclusion a tendency which was already marked, but it accomplished something which had hitherto only been suggested. It reduced the sacred and the divine to a discontinuous and personal God, the Creator. What is more, it turned whatever lies beyond this world into a prolongation of every individual soul. It peopled heaven and hell with multitudes, condemned with God to the eternal discontinuity of each separate being. Chosen and damned, angels and demons, they all became impenetrable fragments, forever divided, arbitrarily distinct from each other, arbitrarily detached from the totality of being with which they must nevertheless remain connected. The multitude of creatures of chance and the individual creator denied their solitude in the mutual love of God and the elect, or affirmed it in hatred of the damned. But love itself made sure of the final isolation. What had been lost in this atomization of totality was the path that led from isolation to fusion, from the discontinuous to the continuous, the path of violence marked out by transgression. Desire for harmony and conciliation and love and submission took the place of the overwhelming wrench of violence, even while the memory of the early cruelty lasted. I spoke earlier of the Christian evolution of sacrifice. I shall try now to give a general picture of the changes wrought by Christianity in sacred matters. The basic ambiguity. Christianity's reduction of religion to its benign aspect. Christianity's projection of the darker side of religion into the profane world. In Christian sacrifice, the faithful are not made responsible for desiring the sacrifice. They only contribute to the crucifixion by their sins and their failures. This shatters the unity of religion. At the pagan stage, religion was based on transgression, and the impure aspects were no less divine than the opposite ones. The realm of sacred things is composed of the pure and of the impure. Christianity rejected impurity. It rejected guilt, without which sacredness is impossible, since only the violation of a taboo can open the way to it. Pure or favourable sacredness has been dominant since pagan antiquity. But even if it was nothing but a prelude to the transcendental act, impure or ill-omened sacredness was there underneath. Christianity could not get rid of impurity altogether. It could not wipe out uncleanness entirely, but it defined the boundaries of the sacred world after its own fashion. In this fresh definition, impurity, uncleanness, and guilt were driven outside the pale. Impure sacredness was thenceforward the business of the profane world. In the sacred world of Christianity, nothing was allowed to survive which clearly confessed the fundamental nature of sin or transgression. The devil, angel or god of transgression, of disobedience and revolt, was driven out of the world of the divine. Its origin was a divine one, but in the Christian order of things, which prolonged Judaic mythology, transgression was the basis, not of his divinity, but of his fall. The devil had fallen from divine favour, which he had possessed only to lose. He had not become profane, strictly speaking. He retained a supernatural character because of the sacred world he came from. But no effect was spared to deprive him of the consequences of his religious quality. The cults that no doubt still persisted, a survival from the days of impure divinities, was stamped out. Death by fire was in store for anyone who refused to obey, and who found in sin a sacred power and a sense of the divine. Nothing could stop Satan from being divine, but this enduring truth was denied with the rigours of torment. A cult which had indisputably upheld certain aspects of religion was now thought of as nothing but a criminal parody of religion. Its very aura of sacredness was considered a profanation. The principle of profanation is the use of the sacred for profane purposes. Even in the heart of paganism, uncleanness could result from contact with something impure. But only in Christianity did the existence of the impure world become a profanation in itself. The profanation resided in the fact that it existed, even if pure things were not themselves sullied. The original contrast between the sacred and the profane world subsided into the background with the coming of Christianity. One side of the profane allied itself to the pure half, the other to the impure half of the sacred. The evil to be found in the profane world joined with the diabolical part of the sacred, and the good joined with the divine. The light of sanctity shone on the good, whatever good may have meant in practical terms. The word sanctity originally meant sacred things, but this quality became associated with a life dedicated to good and to God at the same time. Footnote: however, the underlying affinity between sanctity and transgression has never ceased to be felt. Even in the eyes of believers, the libertine is nearer to the saint than the man without desire. Profanation resumed the original meaning of profane contact that it had in pagan religion, but it possessed another implication. Profanation in paganism was essentially unlucky, deplorable from all points of view. Transgression alone, in spite of its dangerous nature, had the power to open a door onto the sacred world. Profanation in Christianity was neither the same as original transgression, although rather like it, nor the same as early profanation. It most resembled transgression. Paradoxically, Christian profanation, being a contact with something impure, gained access to the essentially sacred, gained access to the forbidden world. But this underlying sacredness was simultaneously profane and diabolic as far as church was concerned. In spite of everything, there was a sort of formal logic about the church's attitude. What she regarded as sacred was separated from the profane world by well-defined formal limits that had become traditional. The erotic, the impure, or the diabolic were not separated from the profane world in the same way. They lacked a formal character, an easily understood demarcation. In the original world of transgression, the impure was itself well defined, the stable forms accentuated by traditional rites. What paganism regarded as unclean was automatically regarded as sacred at the same time. That which condemned paganism or Christianity had to be unclean. Held to be unclean was no longer, or never became, the subject of a formal attitude. There may have been a formalization of Sabbaths, but it was never stable enough to persist. If sacred formalism would have none of it, the unclean was condemned to become profane. The merging of sacred uncleanness and the profane seems to have been for some long time contrary to the feeling about the true nature of things persisting in man's memory. But the inverted religious structure of Christianity demanded it. It is perfect insofar as the feeling of sacredness dwindles when it is encased in formal patterns that seem a little out of date. One of the signs of this decline is the lack of heed paid to the existence of the devil these days. People believe in him less and less. I was going to say that they have ceased to believe in him altogether. That means that the dark side of religious mystery, more ill-defined than ever, finally loses all significance. The realm of religion is reduced to that of the God of good, whose limits are those of light. There is no curse on anything in this domain. This development had consequences in the domain of science, which is interested in religion from its own profane point of view. But I must say in passing that my attitude personally is not a scientific one. Without committing myself to particular religious forms, I regard, or my book regards, religion from a religious point of view. The connection between the good and the sacred appears in the work, remarkable in its way by a disciple of Durkheim. Robert Hertz rightly insists on the humanly significant differences between left-hand side and right-hand side. A general belief associated good luck with the right-hand side and bad luck with the left-hand side. That is, the right with the pure, the left with the impure, in spite of the premature death of its author. The study has remained famous. It anticipated other works on the question, which up to then had been rarely tackled. Hertz identified the pure with the holy, the impure with the profane. His work was later than the one which Henri Hubert and Marcel Mauss had devoted to magic, in which the complexity of the domain of religion was already obvious, but the numerous confirmations of instances witnessing to the duality of sacredness was only generally recognized much later. Witches' sabbats. Eroticism fell within the bounds of the profane and was at the same time condemned out of hand. The development of eroticism is parallel with that of uncleanness. Sacredness, misunderstood, is readily identified with evil. While it conserved a sacred quality in people's minds, the violence of eroticism could cause anguish or nausea. But it was not identified with profane evil, with the violation of the rules that reasonably and rationally safeguard people and property. These rules, sanctioned by a sense of taboo, are different from those that proceed from the blind functioning of the taboo, in that they vary according to their rational utility. With eroticism, the preservation of the family was the main consideration, and the sorry plight of fallen woman banished from family life was another. But a coherent whole only took shape within Christianity, when the original sacred character of eroticism ceased to be apparent, at the same time as social considerations gained in importance. The orgy, with its emphasis on the sacred nature of eroticism transcending individual pleasure, was to become the subject of special attention from the Church. The Church was, in general, against eroticism, but this opposition was based on the profane evil of sexual activity outside marriage. The feelings roused by the transgression of the taboo had to be suppressed at all costs. The battle waged by the Church in this matter shows how difficult that was. A world of religion without uncleanness, in which nameless and unrestricted violence was severely condemned, was not accepted straight away. But we know little or nothing of the nocturnal celebrations of the Middle Ages, or of the beginnings of modern times. The fault may lie to some extent with the cruelty of the repressive measures applied against them. Our sources of information are the confessions dragged by the judges from unfortunates put to the torture. Torture made the victims repeat what the judge's imagination suggested. We can only suppose that Christian vigilance could not prevent the survival of pagan festivals, at least in regions of deserted moorlands. We may well imagine a half-Christian mythology inspired by theology, substituting Satan for the divinities worshipped by the yokels of the High Middle Ages. It is not even ridiculous at a pinch to see the devil as a Dionysus redivivus. Certain authors have doubted the existence of witches' sabbats. In our own day, people have questioned the existence of the voodoo cult. That cult exists nonetheless, even if it has sometimes turned into a tourist attraction. Everything leads us to believe that the cult of Satan, to which the voodoo offers resemblances, did indeed exist, even if less frequently in reality than in the minds of the judges. Here is what seems to emerge from readily accessible data. The sabbats vowed in the lonely night to the secret cult of the god, who was the other face of God, could only make more marked a ritual based on the topsy-turvydom of the feast. The judges in the witch trials were no doubt able to persuade their victims to confess to a parody of Christian rites. But the masters of the Sabbat may just as well have thought up these practices themselves as have them suggested by their judges. We cannot tell from one isolated example whether it belongs to the judge's imagination or the real cult, but at least we may assume that sacrilege was the basic principle. The name of Black Mass, which appeared toward the end of the Middle Ages, was a general description of the meaning of the infernal feast. The Black Mass, attended by Huysmans, described in Labas, is indisputably authentic. I think it too much to imagine that the recognised rites of the 17th or 19th centuries derive from the tortures of the Middle Ages. These practices may have exercised their fascination before the judge's interrogations made them a temptation. Imaginary or not, the sabbats are at any rate in keeping with a form that the Christian imagination was, in a sense, obliged to adopt. They describe the unleashing of passions implied and contained in Christianity. Imaginary or not, it is the Christian situation that they define. Transgression in pre-Christian religions was relatively lawful. Piety demanded it. Against transgression stood the taboo, but it could always be suspended as long as limits were observed. In the Christian world, the taboo was absolute. Transgression would have made clear what Christianity concealed, that the sacred and the forbidden are one, that the sacred can be reached through the violence of a broken taboo. As I have already said, Christianity proposed this paradox on the religious plane. Access to the sacred is evil. Simultaneously, evil is profane. But to be in evil and to be free, to exist freely within evil, since the profane world is not subject to the restraints of the sacred world, was not only the condemnation, but also the reward of the guilty. The excessive pleasure of the licentious answered the horror of the faithful. For the faithful, license condemned the licentious and showed up their corruption. But corruption, or evil, or Satan, were objects of adoration to the sinner, man or woman, and dear to him or to her. Pleasure plunged deep into evil. It was essentially a transgression, transcending horror, and the greater the horror, the deeper the joy. Imaginary or not, the stories of the sabbats mean something. They are the dream of a monstrous joy. The books of de Sade expand these tales. They go much further, but still in the same direction. It is always a matter of defying the taboo. If this was not done according to rules, an enormous possibility opened up towards profane liberty, the possibility of profanation. Transgression was organised and limited. Even yielding to the temptation of ritual procedure, profanation bore within itself the entry into limitless potentialities, indicating now the richness of boundless possibilities and now their disadvantages, rapid exhaustion and death to follow. Pleasure and the certainty of doing wrong. Just as the simple taboo created eroticism in the first place in the organised violence of transgression, Christianity in its turn deepened the degree of sensual disturbance by forbidding organised transgression. the monstrous practices of those Sabbat nights, real or imaginary, or of the lonely prison where de Sade wrote the Cent 20 Journées, had a general form. Baudelaire stated a universally valid truth when he wrote, "I say the unique and supreme pleasure of love lies in the certainty of doing evil, and men and women know from birth that all pleasure is to be found in evil." I said first that pleasure was bound up with transgression, but evil is not transgression, it is transgression condemned. Evil is in fact sin. Sin is what Baudelaire means. The accounts of Sabbats in their turn correspond with this desire to sin. De Sade denied evil and sin, but he had to introduce the notion of irregularity to account for the bursting of the sensual climax. He even had frequent recourse to blasphemy. He sensed the silliness of profanation if the blasphemer denied the sacred nature of the good that blasphemy was intended to despoil. Yet he went on blaspheming. The necessity and the impotence of de Sade's blasphemy are significant, however. The Church had denied the sacred nature of erotic activity as part of transgression in the first place. Reacting against this, free thinkers denied in general what the Church held to be divine. By her denial, the Church finally almost lost the power to evoke a sacred presence, especially insofar as the devil, the unclean one, ceased to stir up a deep-seated trouble in man's mind. At the same time, freethinkers ceased to believe in evil. They were thus on the way to a state of affairs in which, since eroticism was no longer a sin, and since they could no longer be certain of doing wrong, eroticism was fast disappearing. In an entirely profane world, nothing would be left but the animal mechanism. No doubt the memory of sin might persist. It would be like feeling that there was a trap somewhere. When a situation is transcended, there is no going back to its starting point. In liberty, liberty is impotent. Yet liberty still means the decision how to use oneself. Undertaken with lucidity, and in spite of this impoverishment, physical activity might be influenced by the conscious memory of an endless metamorphosis whose various stages would still be possible. But anyway, we shall see that black eroticism returns by a devious route, and finally emotional eroticism, the most ardent kind after all, might gain what physical eroticism had almost lost. Footnote: I cannot dwell any longer within the framework of this book upon the significance of a memory of black eroticism in emotional eroticism, which transcends it. I will just say, though, that black eroticism can be resolved in the awareness of a couple in love. The significance of black eroticism is seen in the awareness in the shadowy form. The possibility of sin arises, only to disappear again. It cannot be grasped, but it does arise. The memory of sin is not the aphrodisiac that sin itself once was, but with sin everything finally vanishes. A sense of catastrophe or disillusion follows on the heels of enjoyment. In emotional eroticism, the beloved can no longer escape. He is held fast in the vague memory of the successive possibilities which have made their appearance as eroticism has evolved. The clear realization of these diverse possibilities written into that long development leading up to the power of profanation is above all able to show the unity of the ecstatic moments which make a sense of the continuity of all being accessible to discontinuous creatures. An ecstatic lucidity is therefore possible, bound up with the knowledge of the limits of being.